London, February 13th, 1542. A gray sky hangs low over the Tower of London. There is no wind, no birds, no whisper of comfort in the morning air, just a weight pressing down on everything, like history itself is holding its breath. In a small, dim hallway, a girl walks slowly toward her death. She is not yet 20. Her shoes are thin, the ground frozen. She walks with quiet steps, watched closely by men who won't meet her eyes. Her name is Catherine Howard, fifth wife of King Henry VIII, Queen of England. And in just a few minutes, nothing more than a silence. No one dares to speak aloud. The night before, she asked for a block of wood to be brought to her cell, not for prayer, not for comfort, but to practice kneeling, to practice placing her neck across it, to practice dying. She knew there would be no second chance, no time to adjust, and she, a teenager raised in the shadows of courtly lust and whispers, wanted to get it right. No one ever taught her how to be a queen, and no one ever taught her how to die like one. So she taught herself. If that image stays with you, if it pulls something in your chest, stay with me. Because here, at Torture Vault, we don't just tell stories from history. We expose the quiet cruelty that too often gets written over, dressed up in romance, or erased entirely. And Catherine Howard's story is not a fairy tale. It's a caution soft and cold as the stone beneath her feet. If this is your first time watching, I invite you to subscribe, not out of habit, but because these stories matter, because sometimes the quietest voices leave the deepest echoes. Now let's return to that morning. Catherine is dressed in black wool, no jewels, no veil, no crown. The hair that once caught the eye of a king is hidden under a plain hood. There is no royal procession, no clergy, no music, just the heavy steps of her guards and the sound of her breath in the air. The scaffold awaits her near the White Tower, a short walk, but a long descent in dignity. Anne Boleyn had met her end there just 6 years before, Catherine's own cousin. But Anne had a French swordsman. Catherine gets the axe. The wooden block is rough, the platform damp with frost. The executioner stands ready, hooded, faceless, still. He doesn't move, doesn't flinch, neither does she. The crowd is hushed, silent, an eerie thing in Tudor England, where executions were often theater. But this is different. This is a queen, a girl queen, a royal turned scapegoat among the watchers. No one speaks. A young maid fingers her rosary, knuckles white. A boy too young to understand cranes his neck to see. Far above them, behind a slit window in the tower. Some say the king is watching. Others say he stayed in bed, unable to bear it. Still others say he wanted to see for himself what treason looked like when it bled. Catherine climbs the steps. No trembling, no tears. She says nothing. No confession, no grand farewell. Just a quiet glance toward the heavens, as if asking it not to look away. She kneels. She lowers herself. She remembers what she practiced. She lays her neck upon the block with precision, as if trying not to inconvenience the man who will kill her. The executioner lifts the axe. There is no scream. There is no second blow. Only the sound of a life being reduced to silence. They bury her within the grounds of the tower, just steps from Anne Boleyn, close enough for history to whisper between their graves. But what follows is stranger than death. It is erasure. No public mourning, no legacy, no songs, no monuments, just shame. Quiet, heavy, endless. No one dares speak her name, because to say Catherine Howard aloud was to admit the crown could be wrong, that the king could be deceived, that perhaps a young girl was never meant to survive a world built on power, secrets, and fear. So, what happened? Why would the court turn so violently on a girl who wore the crown for barely a year? Was she reckless? Was she foolish? Was she in love? Or was she like so many women before and after her, simply in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with no protection and no escape? Because when the court wanted her gone, there was no trial she could win, no mercy she could buy, and no voice loud enough to save her. In our next episode, we go back before the crown, before the king, before the tower, to a girl growing up in the household of the Duchess of Norfolk, where too many doors stayed open too late, and too few people cared who visited whom in the dark. A place where Catherine learned early that beauty was a currency, but never a shield. If you want to understand how she got here to the block, to the silence, join me in part 2. And if you're already feeling the chill of injustice in this story, drop a comment below. Tell me, do you believe she knew the danger? Or was she sentenced before she ever had the chance to understand it? Subscribe to follow the rest of her story, because history may have silenced her, but we don't have to. Before the block, before the crown, before the king's eyes ever fell on her, there was a girl lost inside a house of women, not a palace, not a convent, but something in between and far more dangerous than either. Catherine Howard was born around 1523 into the powerful but politically hungry Howard family. Her father was a younger son in a noble house, too poor to raise her himself, too proud to send her far. So he passed her off to the Duchess of Norfolk. But don't picture warmth. This wasn't a grandmother's house with tea and lace. It was a great manor, loud and cold, where dozens of noble daughters were packed together like forgotten cards in a gilded drawer. There was no locked chamber, no private tutor, no gentle hand to guide her. The girls shared beds, they shared servants, and they shared secrets. At night, the halls whispered. Lovers snuck through unlocked doors. Tutors stayed too long after lessons. And for a girl like Catherine, beautiful, curious, and desperately eager to be loved, it didn't take long for someone to take notice. That someone was Henry Mannix, her music teacher. She was around 13. He was older. He praised her hands, her voice, her beauty. And then, he touched. Today, we'd call it grooming. Back then, it was barely acknowledged unless it caused scandal. It didn't, not yet. And so it faded, until Francis Dereham appeared. Dereham was no nobleman. He was no king. But to Catherine, he might have seemed like freedom, like attention that wasn't hidden or wrong. He brought her gifts, letters, promises. They called each other husband and wife, though no vows were exchanged, at least, not officially. Was it love? Was it pressure? Was it both? Dereham would later claim they planned to marry. Catherine would later deny it. Only the walls of the Duchess's house know the truth, and they never talked. But here's what matters. This past, these men would return, and when they did, they would destroy her. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, because Catherine didn't rise through the court by accident. She was noticed, not by the king, not yet, but by those around him. She was brought to court as a lady-in-waiting to Anne of Cleves, Henry's fourth wife. The German queen was clever, plain, and unfortunately, not to the king's taste. Henry found Anne dull, distant. He wanted youth, beauty, obedience. And then he saw Catherine, young, delicate, radiant, barely out of childhood, and yet already trained not in politics, but in the art of pleasing powerful men. She danced, she smiled, she bowed, she wore silk like it belonged to her. And the king, a man nearly 3 decades older, plagued with ulcers and fury, fell headlong into infatuation. But was Catherine in love? Was she afraid? Or had she simply learned that saying yes was safer than saying no? There's a portrait of her from that time, narrow face, soft eyes, mouth slightly parted. She looks still, as if holding her breath. Look closely, and you might ask, did she know she was being hunted? Or did she believe, just for a moment, that this was safety at last? She married Henry in July 1540. She was probably 17. He was 49. She wore the crown. She received gifts. She signed letters. Your humble and obedient wife and servant. But behind the tapestries, the old ghosts began to stir. Derham returned. Whether she invited him or he forced his way in, no one can say for certain. What we do know is that she gave him a position in her household. He threatened to expose their past, perhaps to shame her, perhaps to win her back, perhaps just to survive. Then came Thomas Culpeper, the king's own groom, handsome, ambitious, familiar. Catherine and Culpeper began meeting in secret, alone, at night. Letters were exchanged, tender, dangerous, handwritten things that should have been burned but weren't. Why did she do it? Was it love? Was it loneliness? Or had she finally realized that a crown was not a shield and her only chance at freedom was in a lover's arms? Because here's the truth no one likes to say out loud. Catherine may have been queen, but she was never safe. She didn't control her marriage. She didn't choose her past. She didn't pick the men who desired her, but she was held responsible for all of it. And in the court of Henry VIII, love was a crime, especially for a woman, especially for a queen. So when the whispers reached the king's ear, when the letters were found, when the confessions were extracted, it was already too late. Derham was tortured, Culpeper was executed, and Catherine was left to wait. We'll speak of her trial in the next part, if you can even call it that. But before we move on, ask yourself this: is it betrayal if no one ever told you the rules? Is it treason to fall in love when love was the only thing you were ever taught to offer? Catherine Howard wasn't just a girl who married badly. She was a child of silence, raised in the shadows, and thrown into a world that consumed her faster than she could grow into it. And still, there are those who called her reckless, promiscuous, a flirt, a fool. So tell me this: is it fair to blame a girl for walking into the fire when no one ever told her the house was burning? Next, we'll follow Catherine through the final, unraveling days of her queenship, the letters, the confrontation, the moment the king stopped loving and started condemning. And we'll answer a question few ever dared to ask: when Catherine Howard lost her crown, did she ever really have it in the first place? Subscribe now, and don't miss what comes next. Because sometimes, the smallest voices carry the deepest truths, and Catherine's has been silent long enough. She didn't seek the crown, but the crown found her anyway, wrapped in silk, sealed with a kiss, and gilded with promises she was far too young to understand. Catherine Howard didn't walk into power. She was ushered in slowly, softly, like a girl being led through a garden, not knowing the path was edged with knives. When Catherine first entered court, she wasn't a queen. She wasn't even important. She was a lady-in-waiting to Queen Anne of Cleves, Henry VIII's fourth wife, a marriage that had been arranged more for diplomacy than desire, and it showed. Anne was kind, intelligent, but to Henry, utterly unappealing. He called her the Flanders mare, a cruel nickname, whispered behind closed doors, and eventually, straight to her face. And while Anne walked the cold marble halls of the palace, doing her best to be queen to a king who could barely look at her, Catherine appeared, not with a plan, not with ambition. She was young, charming, radiant. 17, maybe less, with a lightness that made her seem untouched by everything that had darkened the king's life. Henry was 50, overweight, sick, in pain, physical and emotional, and suddenly, here was Catherine smiling, laughing, dancing in a way Anne never could. It wasn't long before the king's gaze shifted, and when a king looks at you like that, what do? Could she have said no? Could anyone? What we know is this: the invitations came, the gifts followed, and soon. Henry's obsession burned hotter than his leg ulcers. Catherine was showered in jewels, paraded like youth itself, and the moment the king's marriage to Anne was annulled on grounds of non-consummation, Catherine stepped into her place. On July 28, 1540, Catherine Howard became Queen of England. The ink on Anne's annulment wasn't even dry. The same day Anne lost her crown, Catherine gained hers, and in that exchange, history shifted. The court celebrated, the people cheered, and Henry, for the first time in years, smiled. But what was Catherine feeling? Was she in love? Did she believe this man, this king, truly adored her? Or did she already sense that she was a symbol, not a bride? Look closely at her portrait. It's the face of someone trying to be still, eyes forward, lips closed, a girl caught between wanting to be good and knowing goodness wouldn't protect her. She signed letters, "Your most humble and obedient wife and servant." She visited the sick, gave gifts, did everything expected of a Tudor queen. And yet, behind the silks and titles, she remained what she'd always been, a girl raised in the shadows, praised for her beauty, taught to please and survive. How does one transition from being a lady-in-waiting to the wife of the most dangerous man in England, quietly, carefully, with eyes wide open? The court watched her, smiled at her, praised her as a jewel of womanhood. But no one told her what to do when the king grew cold, because of course, he did. The leg that oozed, the bad temper, the fear of betrayal that haunted Henry's every step. He loved Catherine, or believed he did, but he was also haunted by Anne Boleyn, by his own decline, by the creeping suspicion that youth can't love age without hiding something. And Catherine was lonely, surrounded by eyes, courtiers, pages, and pressure, and yet completely alone. She began to lean on familiar faces, people from her past, men who knew her before she was queen, before she had to smile on command. Francis Derham reappeared. Thomas Culpeper crept closer. Did she intend to betray the king, or was she just trying to feel human? Because here's the quiet truth. The crown gave her everything: dresses, diamonds, power. But it took something too. It took freedom, spontaneity, trust, and the ability to love without fear. And so, Catherine Howard, Queen of England, began to live two lives. By day, the obedient wife; by night, someone else, someone scared, or bold, or simply 17. But the court noticed. They always notice. So now ask yourself, if you were her, young, isolated, adored but not loved, would you have done anything differently, or would you have reached for comfort, even if it meant risking your life? Next, we will follow the thread as it begins to unravel. The letters, the glances, the footsteps down stone corridors that should have never been taken. And the moment Catherine Howard realized the crown wasn't made of gold, it was made of glass, and it was starting to crack. Subscribe now, because the next chapter is the one that cost her everything. It didn't happen all at once. The fall of Catherine Howard didn't come with a scream or a scandal in broad daylight. It began with whispers, soft, persistent, and perfectly aimed, in Tudor England. Silence was never quiet. It had layers, echoes, and behind every tapestry, hung in a royal palace, someone was always listening. It started with a letter, not the kind you send, the kind you forget to burn. A note, in Catherine's own hand, was discovered. It wasn't meant for the king. It wasn't a formal court communication. It was intimate, delicate, a little too warm in tone. It was addressed to Thomas Culpeper. He was young, handsome, trusted by the king, and he had become something dangerous, familiar to the queen. Some say he was her lover. Others say she only wished he were. But it was enough. In a court built on perception, suspicion was a death sentence, and Catherine had given them more than enough to suspect. Suddenly, she was being watched. Her ladies were questioned. Her letters scrutinized. Those midnight meetings behind closed doors. Now they mattered in ways she hadn't imagined. Did she think she could keep secrets in a palace designed for betrayal? Or had she finally started believing she was untouchable? One of her chambermaids, Joan Bulmer, confessed that Catherine and Culpeper had met in private, more than once, often late, always without permission. Why confess? Because in Henry's court, if someone was going to hang, it was best if it wasn't you. Meanwhile, another ghost from her past stepped forward, Francis Derham. He was furious, bitter. He claimed he and Catherine had been as good as married before she ever met the king, that she had promised herself to him, that she had lied to everyone, including her husband. But Catherine denied it, again and again. And yet, evidence kept piling up. She had brought Derham into her household. She had elevated him. She had given him proximity, something no queen should do without reason. Was it kindness, fear, a bribe to keep him quiet? Or was it love, reckless, doomed love? We don't know for certain, and maybe she didn't either. But the damage was done. Letters were examined, servants were interrogated, the walls were closing in. One account describes the moment she realized what was coming. She collapsed in tears, crying out that she was utterly undone. She asked to see the king, begged for one final audience. She was denied, and in that refusal, everything changed. Up until then, Henry VIII had been confused, hurt, even grieved. But now, he was angry. Imagine it. You're a powerful man, aging and ill. You've just married a teenage queen full of light and grace and promise. And now you're told she's betrayed you, lied to you, perhaps even laughed at you. What does that do to a king's pride? To his rage, it turns affection into vengeance. Henry left Hampton Court and never returned to her. He refused to see her face again. In a single day, Catherine went from beloved wife to imprisoned traitor, alone in a room with the knowledge that everything was being taken from her. Her title, her future, her name. Culpeper and Derham were arrested, tortured, pressured into confession. Derham was brutally executed, hanged, disemboweled, quartered. Culpeper, perhaps favored once, was granted the mercy of beheading. And Catherine. She waited. Some say she wept daily. Others say she barely spoke. But one thing is certain. She was never told when the axe would fall, until it did. Let's pause for a moment. Imagine being 19 years old, having lived your life pleasing others, playing a role you were never taught, in a court that punished mistakes with steel. You wake each day not knowing if it will be your last. The walls don't talk, but the silence is worse, and no one comes. That was Catherine Howard's final winter. Still, there are people who call her foolish, who say she brought it on herself. But consider this. Can a child raised in secrecy be expected to thrive under scrutiny? Can someone used by powerful men be blamed for trying to choose one of her own, and in a palace of masks? Was her greatest sin simply being honest with the wrong man? In one of her final letters, or what was believed to be hers, she reportedly said, "I die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culpeper." Did she write it? We may never know. But what we do know is this: Catherine Howard didn't fall from grace. She was pushed by the weight of her past, by the expectations she never asked for, and by a court that fed on silence, shame, and scandal. She had no trial, no defenders, no voice. She was judged not for what she proved, but for what others whispered about her from behind the tapestries. In next part, we'll walk with Catherine through her final days, the night she practiced laying her head on the block, the guards who wouldn't meet her eyes, and the moment she stepped onto the scaffold and looked up at the sky, not as a queen, but as a girl who finally understood how power forgets. You won't want to miss it. Subscribe now and ask yourself, was she ever really given a choice? Or was Catherine Howard doomed the moment she was noticed? Because in the court of Henry VIII, being seen was the first step toward being destroyed. By the time they told her she was going to die, Catherine Howard had already stopped asking questions. She was held alone in the Tower of London, not the grand royal apartments she had once walked through in silk slippers, but a cold, silent cell behind stone and iron. No letters, no visitors, no voices except the ones she imagined. They say she was given no trial, no chance to defend herself, no moment to look her accusers in the eye. Only a sentence passed without ceremony, like the breaking of a toy no longer wanted. And Catherine, she didn't cry, at least, not in front of them. What she did ask for was simple: a block of wood, not for warmth, not to build anything, but to practice. Because in the morning, she would have to kneel before the axe, and she didn't want to fumble, didn't want to delay, didn't want to scream. She wanted to do it right. So all through that final night, Catherine Howard, Queen of England, practiced how to die. Alone in her cell, lit only by flickering candlelight, she knelt, lowered her head, lifted it again, knelt once more. It was rehearsal, not for a performance, but for her own ending. Not to impress, not to survive, just to leave with dignity, because dignity was the last thing they hadn't yet taken. That image, a girl no older than your daughter, your niece, your younger self kneeling over and over to learn how to die quietly. It should haunt us, because that wasn't justice. That was theater, and the curtain would rise at dawn. The morning of February 13th, 1542 was as gray as grief itself. The frost clung to stone. No bells rang, no trumpets sounded. There were no flowers, no prayers, no royal send-off, only footsteps. Catherine walked to the scaffold unescorted, no attendants, no priest holding her hand. Her dress was dark, modest, no jewels. She had once been draped in gold. Now she wore the color of mourning her own. The crowd was silent, save for the crunch of feet on icy ground. Even the sky felt too ashamed to look. Among the onlookers were noblemen who once called her Grace, ladies who had braided her hair, and guards who now gripped their halberds a little too tightly. At the top of the scaffold stood the block, and beside it, the man who would sever her from the world, the executioner. They say he wasn't the one she requested. She had asked for a specific man, one known for precision, clean, swift, almost merciful. She was denied, even in death. She wasn't allowed to choose the hands that would take her life. Still, she climbed the steps. Some accounts say she gave a short speech. Others say she said nothing at all. But the line history remembers the one that still echoes down centuries is this: I die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culpeper. Is it true? We don't know. There is no official record of her saying it. But we do know this. It's exactly what they didn't want her to say. It's the kind of sentence that shakes thrones, that turns a queen from a footnote into a legend. Because in that one sentence, if she said it, Catherine Howard declared that love forbidden, fatal love was worth more than a crown, and that is something kings have always feared. She knelt, just as she had practiced. She laid her neck upon the block, and when the axe fell, Catherine Howard left behind more than a body. She left behind a question, not about guilt, not about scandal, but about what kind of world demands a girl be perfect or be punished. What kind of court rewards silence and crushes softness? What kind of king crowns a child and then kills her for acting like one after her execution? There were no processions, no memorials. She was buried within the tower, near Anne Boleyn, cousins in blood, and now in fate. Two queens who learned too late that being chosen is not the same as being safe. So what are we left with? A name, a broken love story, a life lived quickly, desperately, and under watch. But also this, the sound of a girl practicing her own death in the dark because no one ever taught her how to survive in the light. Catherine Howard was not a seductress, not a schemer, not a fool. She was a girl who trusted too easily, who believed attention meant affection, who mistook desire for devotion, and for that, she died. If you've followed her story this far, ask yourself, would she have been safer if she were less beautiful, less kind, less hopeful? Or was her only true mistake being born into a world where women's worth was measured by obedience and paid for in silence? We may never know what she whispered in her final breath, but if history had listened more closely, maybe she wouldn't have been the one who had to fall silent. Thank you for watching Torture Vault. If Catherine Howard's story has made you feel something, grief, anger, or simply the need to know more, consider subscribing. Because this was not just the story of a queen, it was the story of a girl and the crown that destroyed her.